Good morning, everyone. My name is Corinne Bonnevité from the marketing team here at ILEX. Welcome to our Change Management webinar. On the housekeeping note today, feel free to ask questions during the webinar. Andy West, our presenter today, will answer your question at the end of this session. The webinar will be recorded and you will receive the replay within 48 hours. We invite you to visit our website, ilexgroup.com. To our download section, you will find some very useful insights. You can also follow us, like our social media, to keep you updated on our upcoming events. We will ask you a few questions at the end of this session for us to improve our webinars. Now, have a very good session, and over to you, Andy.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to this webinar. As it says, I'm Andy West. I'm a senior trainer here at ILEX. I'm the lead trainer for change management and the broader context project management courses that we run. Today's webinar is to look specifically at the impact that change has on middle managers and the impact that middle managers can have on change in an organization. And it's to recognize the impact they have on success or failure of changes across the organization. And strategies, the interest said, I will give you the success, how to make it work. I think I'm going to suggest strategies rather than tell you every way of making it work. I think there's way too broad a kind of coverage there. But anyway, what I'm going to have a look at is who do we mean by middle managers, what do we mean by change, what theories are there involving some of these sorts of things, and then try and suggest some ways that we can use our middle managers across the organization to improve the success rates of change across the organization. As I say, if you have questions as you go through, if you type in your questions, my colleagues will make a note of these and pass them on to me. I will try and answer those as we go. Otherwise, leave them to the end. There will be a question session at the end to give you an opportunity to ask a few more questions. So, thank you for your time. I shall crack on now. Firstly, change. What is change? Well, I just thought I'd go and pick up some definitions from the dictionary. And change there, to make the form, nature, content, future, course, etc. of something different from what it is, of what it would be if left alone. Which does kind of explain change in organizations. If we leave them alone, they stay as they are. If we want to do something different, we have to change them. And this is a natural thing for organizations. If we don't change our organizations, it stays exactly as it is, and the world moves on, and it leaves us alone. And we start to stagnate, and therefore, commercial organizations, they make changes and use somebody else. So it is a natural part of what we do. Now, there's some interesting discussions at the moment about, are we talking about change in organizations, are we talking about transformation? And you might consider that a scale thing. We're just going to kind of call it change because you're changing something. I do like the term transformation, which is to alter something completely, to do something completely different to what we're doing. And in the modern world, when we're looking at organizations, that actually is sometimes the challenge of what we have to do. How we work at the moment is not appropriate. We've got to do something quite different. Now, that clearly is a huge amount of change for an organization, whereas simple changes might be new systems, new processes, new organization structures, things that we update as we go through. All of these things are delivered as projects or programs or collections of programs because we need a structured way of making this work. So projects and programs are the structural element, and we've talked about those quite a lot in the past. Those are the sorts of things that all organizations are talking about. The idea of change is almost the more holistic sitting behind that of, well, how do people change? How do we get people to accept change? How do we kind of get them engaged so that they want to change? It's that kind of more holistic kind of thought process. And it's much more about the transition of people and the organization rather than the methodology by which we deliver changes in organizations. So I'm going to kind of leave projects and programs alone completely today and look at this transition process. What happens to us as people? What happens to our organization as we go through? And it's important to understand that it affects us both as individuals and as teams and as corporate entities. So all of those things will be impacted. Now, the thrust of today's talk is the middle managers. And the middle managers in any organization are often the key to the success of that organization. They're the people that translate the strategy from the top of the organization into the tactical of what we do. They grab, hopefully, the ideas and problems and issues faced by the day-to-day staff, enable things to change as we go through. So on our simple diagram here, which I will be using for a couple of other things, the middle managers are all those people in the middle between the frontline staff and our senior management. There may be one layer of this, two layers of this, three layers of this. It depends on the nature of our organization, the hierarchical system that we have in place. But they're a group in the middle. And interestingly, their primary function is to ensure that the business as usual is delivered. They're there to run the day-to-day work of our organizations, to ensure that what we're doing meets the needs of our customers, of our regulators, all those other people who have a vested interest in the success of this organization. They're the people that make it happen. The important point here, though, is that most of what they do is focusing on the business as usual, the day-to-day running, the improvements to make it more efficient, not to change it. So in lots of ways, our middle managers have a vested interest in the status quo. They've got there because they're good at running that business as usual. And if we leave that running, then clearly our organization starts to stagnate. So we have to do change. And there's no, if like statistical numbers proving difficulty with these sorts of things, but there is some kind of narrative evidence that if middle managers are purely focused on the business as usual, then the organization struggles to implement change. Taking a quote from the reference book we use for the change management course, which is called the Effective Change Manager's Handbook, which is published by the by Kogan Page, but is by the APMG International Examinations Board and the Change Management Institute. There's a little case study. It says the CEO was seeking to generate fundamental change across an organization. He believed the Executive Management Committee was committed, and much of the shop floor was committed. Yet communication seemed to get lost in the middle in what he termed the blotting paper layer. And so sometimes middle managers seem to kind of this inert and highly absorbent blockage. A group of people in the middle who, when ideas are fed into them, just kind of diffuse them, settle them down, don't move them on so things don't move underneath. And if ideas or problems are coming up, are kind of answered but not really changed. Before I worked for ILX, I used to work for a water company here in the UK. And the managing director, who I worked with quite closely as part of the training team, described the middle management as the corporate concrete, because he saw them as being set in their ways. They got to where they were by being good at what they did in the way that they'd always done it. And therefore, when we wanted to change things, what we had was a difficulty in moving this corporate concrete, because it kind of set in its ways. Now, that's kind of an archetypal view of how middle managers are. Now, I don't believe that all middle managers are like this, having been a middle manager myself. I know that some are different. However, this is often the viewpoint we're kind of given. And if this is true, even if it's not completely set, but it doesn't want to move very much, there still gives us a struggle in terms of change. What I want to do is just show you a couple of examples of some theory and how this kind of blockage might interact with the difficulties in two different organization structures. What I will refer to is something called Morgan's metaphors. Gareth Morgan developed in his work some metaphors to describe organizations. They're used as a kind of quick way of understanding the organization and how it operates. So there are 8 metaphors in total that he identified. We have machines, where everything kind of works because it fits together as a machine. Every bit has its place, essentially. We have organisms, which are much more open systems, and they evolve. like living things. There tends to be, or has to be, huge amounts of communication across organisations to ensure that all parts of the organisation are evolving in the same way at the same time. We then have brains. Now, brains are where we rely on kind of the knowledge bank. Who knows these sorts of things? And a good example is that if you want to make systems work, it's not what's written down, it's who you have to talk to make these sorts of things work. So the process and the success of the organisation is bedded in certain people or certain teams. Change in brains often comes out because you engage those people who know how to improve it, and that's where you use that kind of knowledge. He talks about cultures as the fourth one. Cultures are kind of shared systems of meaning and behaviour, and therefore they adapt because they share a need or a view that something needs to alter. So it tends to be, again, rather like the organism, everything's changing. Perhaps a more common one that you may have bumped into is what he called the political systems, where the organisation runs and is changed by power groups, people who come together and create coalitions, guiding entities that move things forward. The one interesting thing about political systems is they're usually winners and losers. The winners are the people with the power, the losers are the people who don't have the power. Their ideas often don't get taken forward. One of the others I want to hit, flux and transformation. Flux and transformation is often a metaphor for chaos in action. This is the organisation where change is not centrally derived. Change happens at the edges, by the edges of the organisation meeting the outside world and changing to suit it does, which does mean that all different parts of the organisation may be changing in different ways. Little centralised control. The last two metaphors that De Morgan discussed that I want to just quickly cover today are instruments of domination, which are intrinsically systems of control, where the organisation sees people not as people, but as units of production. And the whole process and structure is designed to forcing people to do things that they want. I think a simple analogy here is some very traditional production lines where people have a very simple task that's repeatable, and it's just about control. I want that done, and I want that done quickly. I want it done in the way I've told you it's done. Again, changing those tends to happen because the organisation decides it needs to change its control from the top. So it's kind of like an extreme version of a machine. The last one is often seen as quite a negative one. It's called psychic prisons, where there are rules of how the organisation works, but those rules are implicit. And failure to follow those rules is often seen as a slur on the person in charge. The most common example of this is often given as cults, where it is about having that charismatic leadership, but it's a personal thing if you don't do everything right. Now, I'm not going to try and cover all of these today, but I wanted to look at particularly at two particularly where the middle management can have a huge impact on reducing the ability to change in the organisation. Now, I can have the same in all of the others, but I just wanted to cover two in a little bit more detail today, rather than try and cover everything. The two I'm going to have a look at are machines and flux and transformation. Machines are essentially where we pull all the elements of the organisation together and everything has its place. A good example of this often is organisations that use a lot of process-driven rules. You can take a chunk out of the process and improve it, and as long as the connectors still fit to what's going on the rest of the organisation, we can almost do these things in isolation. It's like upgrading modules. But the view of how to do this usually comes from the top. So if we look at the machine metaphor, then change starts at the top and is driven down. Now the problem we have here is that our middle management has to be willing to pass that change on, to cascade the information. And if they have a vested interest in keeping things as they are, the current status quo, then that movement doesn't happen. Essentially what happens, it stops, if I just go back, at the middle line. So it doesn't get all the way to the shop floor. And if I give you a real example of this, a much earlier organisation I thought, in fact the first organisation I worked for, there was a cascade policy put in place about total quality, TQ. And the particular point of this is what we wanted was frontline staff to form employee involvement groups. And the idea of this was that the staff would look at those problems, identify solutions, and then pass them up back through the organisation so that the change could be implemented. So if the suggestion came down through the organisation, this is what we should do. And as frontline staff, we started to engage with this because it felt we had some involvement with it. My particular manager and some other managers like him firmly believed and actually said to me that frontline staff do not have the skills and attributes to change the organisation. Change comes from the centre. Change comes from the managers. And as we were doing our employee involvement scripts, as we were trying to identify problems and solutions, we were required by him, as our line manager, to keep him in the loop of what we were talking about. And oddly, every idea that we had, he then passed to somebody in the head office, and it would come out as a suggestion from them. So all of our efforts to improve were cut off in their prime. And therefore, our interest in these employee involvement groups started to lessen. It was seen as something unnecessary. And essentially put a block on it. And therefore, a few managers across the organisation managed to completely stifle this innovation idea, because by showing that they didn't believe in it and didn't support it, and by blocking what we were doing, they actually stopped the whole process working. So essentially what they're doing is getting in the way of the cascade, that they're removing the ability to do this. And part of this is because if they've built this, I use the word empire, that's probably the safest way of calling it, this group of people, this team of people, that they know what they're doing, that they can see how the business is being run. Changes to those things, from either the top or the bottom, should be, well, can be seen as being resisted because it's threats to their little world, threats to their empire. So it's because of those potential negative consequences they often fight. And linking to this is the idea of flux and transformation. With flux and transformation, ideas start at the bottom. Ideas come from the front line. We've got this thought, why don't we? And often the people at the front line can't change everything they want to do. What they therefore need is the support of their manager, particularly if this change should be then moved on to other places, shared with other people. If we have a middle layer that believes that ideas don't come from the front line or that these ideas are a threat to their empire, then those ideas will be carefully sidelined or carefully blocked. And so you start to get that of, yes, it's a nice idea and see how it might work in your particular small team, but it wouldn't work in other places because they do something different. So it also becomes that we're not going to pass this on. And again, it doesn't take very many blocks like this for people at the front line to start to see, this is not really worth me doing this. Why is the point in me getting involved in change if nothing I do goes further? So at that point, we start to lose the ability to change things. There's a question coming that says, should a change manager come from the business as usual organisation, from the project delivery organisation? And I think the answer to that will come clear as we go through. I think essentially I'm going to say both. But if I answer that later on, if I haven't answered that question, please repeat the question later on, and I will come back and answer it. Okay, so there we have, if you like, some structural elements to consider. How do we work in our organisation, and how does change flow through our organisation? Can behaviour patterns of staff derail the process of management instruction success? Yes. And then that comes back to perhaps culture. So if you're looking at a cultural organisation, do staff believe that what they're being asked to do is appropriate and inappropriate? Then you actually can get conflict in change and difficulty of what's going on. I should probably cite the example of the junior doctors and the health minister at the moment as being change being imposed from the top and staff at the bottom resisting it. And clearly at the moment, this is in a confrontational mode, and therefore the change is not being implemented. My view is collaboration is far better than confrontation and these sorts of things. So I think behaviour patterns of staff are one of the key things that we need to consider about how we might make it work. And hopefully that will become clear as we go through some of these things. So there's the, if you like, a couple of models for change in the organisation. The other thing I want to consider is how does impact change, or how does change impact individuals? Get it right around. And one of the clear reference points we use for this is the Kubler-Ross curve. Kubler-Ross, 1969, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross developed this curve as people's reactions to death or to terminal illness. It's been adopted as a change curve, in inverted commas, to show the similar sorts of reactions that people have when they're dealing with change in an organization. And there are a number of standard kind of steps through this particular process that people can stick at. So if you haven't seen these, I'm going to run through it quickly anyway, just so you can see how people react. Afterwards, I'm going to look at is, well, what do they need from us as managers in order to move through this curve? So there is a requirement for support here at different kind of points as we go through. So the first thing is shock. What's happening? Why is this happening? Are they really meaning us? Whenever there's a change, even if it's a good change, there's a little shock value of, well, oh, it's happening. The second step is denial. And if you notice, it talks about morale, energy, performance going up. And also the denial thing is, if we work harder, if we work better, then this change won't happen. Things will stay as they are, and we don't have to worry about change. So even for a positive one, it's kind of, there's the comfort zone of, well, if the things stay as they are, then we don't have to do anything. We have to worry about change. Then what starts to happen is that the third step is kind of anger or blame. And this is almost kind of an external one of, it's being done to us. Why are they doing it to us? That we've always worked well. It's not our fault kind of stuff. This externally focused thing, essentially people ranting about what's going on, complaining about what's going on, which is a natural part of the process. And in lots of ways, this allows them to deal with the shock and the anger because it's externalized. Perhaps more dangerous to the individual is the bargaining and self-blame. In Kubler-Ross, it's called bargaining with God. If I do something different, then this change won't happen, this thing won't happen to me. In change situations, it's people starting to look at that they're the cause of the changes because they've done something wrong. Now this is internalizing the anger. About what's going on. So this is about trying to deal with, things because you think it's your fault. And this kind of leads into depression and confusion, where people can't see what they're going. There is a interesting question coming up that asked, is there a good balance between the relationship between middle managers and frontline staff related to business as usual and intelligent change? I think I'm going to deal with that a bit later on, so hopefully I shall answer that question. If not, I will come back to it later on. Warning signs, again, I shall look for those sorts of things later on. Do we not find that change is a common part of working life and this change is COVID changing? Yes, change is a common part of life. If people are used to change, what we tend to find is this goes through the curve much quicker. Particularly if we can minimize some of the steps in this curve. If I just continue very quickly, depression and confusion is the lowest point. People can't see a way forward. The light at the end of the tunnel is acceptance, which is, I can now see there's a way out of this. I can now see where we're going. And the last stage is then problem solving, which is I'm starting to make decisions of what I'm going to do, where I'm going to go, what my options are. Now, the question says, is this natural, is this change curving? What we start to find is if you work in organizations where change is a natural thing and where staff are supported through this process, the change curve is done on a much shorter time scale. The dip is much shallower because those sorts of things are kind of more common, and therefore it's not as bad. So what you start to find is that that people kind of go through it much quicker. And if I give you a real example, previous organisation I worked for, change was a kind of natural part. There was a change in organisation structure every year because of the nature. Certainly I will in the future. Change is done as a kind of a natural thing every year. And therefore the shock is kind of, oh, there's another change. And the deniers, oh, they're not going to change us very much. But because it's the end of year change, it's the new financial year, we need a new structure for the new marketplace. It was kind of one to deal with, and therefore the acceptance was, I have a role, I can see where I'm going to fit in the new structure, and problem solving is, who am I working for, what can I get out of the new job? And that kind of change was accepted across the organisation with all the teams. It was a natural part of how we do it. So the curve was there, it was much quicker, much shorter, and much shallower dips. When they did a major reorganisation and shut offices and moved lots of staff to the head office, this curve came back in a much longer time scale, a much deeper curve, because it was not a change that was expected. It was because we were not expecting that sort of change. We were expecting a much simpler one. And it also came about because how the change had been announced. So the sorts of things that help people move through this curve, and again, this is just some words that I've put together to explain this. In order to deal with shock, warning. If we know that the change is coming, it's not as big a shock. If it happens unexpectedly, then this becomes much more difficult for us to deal with. And the example I'm going to give is a real one, in that a major change in structure and where people are based and their roles was announced at the end of year celebration of results. So essentially, we've had a wonderful year, you're doing a wonderful job, we're going to shut your office. Now at that point, the shock was far greater because staff were not expecting that kind of message. Excuse me. How long will it take for people acknowledging the change and can be led for not accepting in the transition? I think the simple answer to that is how long can it take to acknowledge it? It does depend on the circumstances of the change and the size of the change. If it's a change that they were expecting and it's the sort of thing that they've done before, then you might find that actually this timescale is quite compressed. It's difficult to give you an exact figure. Is it days? Is it weeks? I've known of this bad example where people were still in anger 6 months, 4 months after the announcement of the change. So we've got nowhere near the kind of blame and the depression, and no one's really talking about problem solving. There's still lots of anger left. And so what we have there is a very extended timescale because of those particular circumstances. I've also known people walk through this of, we're going to do the standard end of year reorganization for the new financial year, and people are in acceptance and problem solving within a week because the change is something that they A, have anticipated, and B, they've experienced before, and C, their previous experience has always told them there's something good that comes out of this. So being open before change and selling people the benefits of change before you can be surely help reach acceptance much more quickly, don't you think? I absolutely agree. And that's part of that warning thing of acceptance of change. Do we have a culture of change? Are people aware that there will be changes? And so when we announce what the specific change is, people are kind of ready for it. So they understand the value in change, why the organisation has done it. One of the things that's talked about in the theory is what's called survival anxiety, which is what would happen if we didn't do the change. And if as a kind of almost underpinning cultural element, people understood that change is a necessary part of the organisation, that change is about the organisation surviving, growing, and them having more opportunities and a better job, if that's part of your culture, then what you find is that the shock doesn't go away completely, but it's reduced because there's a level of acceptance with the need for change. And so it's almost building those sorts of things in. And the interesting point is if you've worked in an organisation where change historically has been little and far between, when you do changes, they become much more difficult because of that lack of experience, that lack of history. So it is about being open about that. It is about selling people. It is about doing those sorts of things. And if people have got some warning this change is going to happen, one of the things about this is consistency. if people are in denial of, if I do better, they won't change me, the message has to be delivered consistently, fairly, and not harshly, but the change is going to happen. Because if people know that change is going to happen, it can't be avoided, and the reasons for that are being given, it actually helps them understand the benefits of change and the reasons for doing those sorts of things. So there is an element in going through that as we try and understand what's going on. So the consistency of message, everyone is speaking with the same voice. Yes, we are going to change, and yes, this change is going to happen. In terms of then dealing with the later ones, this is when we start to need some people. This is when we need to start having people supporting our staff as they go through this. And this is where the middle managers actually start to become crucial. And this is, if you like, the thrust of my argument, is that if we have middle managers who are resisting change, then some of the skills that we're talking about here, they may not be using appropriately to assist their team to go through this. The other point I should make is that the middle managers are probably going through this as well. So actually, are they being listened to? Are they going through this? Are these the same sort of things being done for them? This is not something that's just done from a manager to the frontline staff. This is being done to those middle managers as well, by their manager and by their senior management. So there is a need for this through the organisation, which you'll see later on as I go through the rest of my talk. So listening to their anger, allowing people to diffuse. Certainly I will read the questions more slowly as I go through. And try and make sure you go through it. What is the impact of too many changes and very frequent changes as a result of changing strategies and priorities? That's an interesting one. One of the things, there are probably two ways of looking at that, too many changes. If you do lots of changes, then it has the benefit that people start to understand that there's change is going to happen and there's lots of change going to happen all the time, and therefore perhaps the shock is reduced of another change coming along. There is also the thought of change fatigue, which is there's too much going on at the moment. And one of the things you start to get here, and this might actually start to import here kind of the support thing of, I don't know where I am at the moment. There's too much going on. What should I focus on? And if we look at what they need here, support on what are the key things we're doing at the moment. How do we, A, keep some of our business as usual going, while still doing the changes? That support is going to be crucial to move people through what's going on. So our line managers have got to understand how to do this. So we'll talk about those sorts of skills they need. In terms of dealing with people in the depression and the confusion area, it's one of the things I put down here is vision. Can I, as a manager, inspire you with where this is going, so you can see, if you like, the light at the end of the tunnel being turned on, so that you can see where we're going. Now, what vision means to different people will be different things. And as a manager, I need to be able to communicate the vision for the team or my department or my section or my business unit to my people in a way that makes sense to them. And by providing that vision, what I'm trying to do is provide people with that light, that of where can I go next. And if I can do that, and you start to move into acceptance, what I can now start to offer you is options of what do you want to do, how do you want to take advantage of this, where do you see yourself going as the future. And of course, problem solving is then about motivation, about inspiring you to do those sorts of things. So if we look at this, these are the sorts of things our people need. And where are they going to get this from? And as I've kind of been saying all the way through, it's our middle managers. It's the people who manage them are being required to do this. But our middle managers are going through this as well, so they need the management at the top. So what we're talking about here is we need this kind of level of support all the way through. So if I can move on and start to have a look at how we might start to make this work. The thought I put, just to note, is it's just who are these people as our middle managers? And when we look at the Effective Change Manager's Handbook, it says these are the heart of the organisation. They have invested years and skill and effort in the success of the organisation and in their people. And in lots of ways, they've had to go through change to get where they are. Change links back to learning. In order to become a manager and move through the management layers, these individuals have had to learn how to do different things. They've invested in change. Therefore, they have those sorts of skills. What we need to make sure is that they are keeping those skills up to date, that they are being encouraged in change as well. So it's making sure that they are involved in those sorts of things. Can they see the value in change? Have they still got that thought process of there's things we can do better? Can we organise those sorts of things? And some of the most successful managers I've worked with have been ones that have actually actively encouraged their staff to come up with ideas, because it allows them to move forward. So just a couple of thoughts that kind of come with it. It says, project management. Effective projects need effective management support. When we look at the Association for Project Management, if you look at the Project Management Institute, one of the things they say are there are kind of 5 key success factors for projects, about delivery of change. And one of those is effective senior management support. Have I got the people above me saying yes? Commitment, support, encouragement. This directly leads to our middle managers. Are they providing those sorts of things? They may be the sponsors of small projects. They may be certainly part of the implementation of larger ones. And then perhaps a more up-to-date quote from 1999. Senge in, we looked at the 5th discipline. One of the things that he actually quotes here, profound change occurs when small-scale initiatives are skillfully nurtured by well-aligned leadership at all levels of the organization and then spread. And this is almost the point that I was talking about when I'm talking about that Kubler-Ross curve. Are all managers involved in this? Do they all understand what's going on? So is management at all layers supporting change? Just in their staff and in what they're doing. So it's kind of allowing people to try things at different levels. And what I've taken from the handbook for change managers, the Effective Change Managers Handbook, is a series about the key role of management in change. And these are some direct kind of quotes. So they said if you want to do successful change, it's engage middle management part of the organisation early in the change process, a critical mass. Have we consulted with them? Do we understand their concerns? One of the things it talks about is, do we have people who are against the change? They call them laggards. Are they against the change because they just don't like change? Or are they against the change because they see some reasons they believe the change won't work? Have we talked to them? They might have some brilliant experience that we can adapt and pick up and kind of build in mitigation systems to avoid those sorts of failures. So to encourage change organisations would need to go through appreciative inquiry to making negative deposits like you do with the curve. I think that's actually a valid quote, is that we need to make sure that people understand the reasons for it, the benefits for it. And if we can understand, if we can enable people to understand the reasons for, and hopefully the value to them, the benefits to them of doing it, essentially one of the things I believe is as stakeholders in change, we're often quite selfish. What's in it for me? And if I help to find a positive in it, I am much more likely to buy because it's positive for me. And what's positive for me may not be the reason that the organisation is doing the change, but it's the things that engage me. It's the heart and soul. It's the emotional stuff. And if I can emotionally buy into that change, I'll do it. Thank you for your comment about enjoying the webinar. Role of management, creating a sense of urgency and the need for change. Without that kind of sense of the need for change, and this might pick up with the next question, is how do you make people understand change is good? I'm not sure you can make people understand. I think you try and have to encourage people to understand, or try and enable people to understand. But the sense of the need for change. Form it's called, as I mentioned earlier on, survival anxiety. What would happen if we didn't? And it is based on that kind of thought process of what's good for me, what's going to happen to this department, this role, what's actually needed. One of the things, I've worked with quite a number of IT organizations, IT-based organizations, where they've had old legacy systems. And often you find there's a small team of people that have developed and maintained this old system for all their working life. And it's their system, it's their, and now we're going to remove it. And one of the things there is that they're often against the change, so it's how to make the changes good. And it's then of, if they only stay, look at this technology is old, can we enable them to learn some new technology which might increase their employability, their options, their other things, give them something new, give them something interesting. And it is, in lots of ways, the whiffing factor. What's in it for me? People's personal goals are not always completely aligned with the organizational goals, but there is often an overlap, and it's finding that overlap to actually understand it, and that's actually, if you like, the need for change. In terms of management, access to things led to the change. If the middle management get to see the thinking behind it, and I personally think that this is not just for middle management, this is actually for everybody. If we all understand the privileged access, if we all start to understand what's going on, it allows us to understand the nature of the change and what's going to happen and how we're going to support to it. Piloting ideas, getting feedback. Again, it's the why will this work, why will this not work? And if we can get people to understand how we make it work, then it's about kind of picking up the difficulties. One of the things I've heard here, and it comes from Covey's work, seek first to understand before you're then to be understood. If people are giving you objections, why do they have those objections? Can you then resolve those objections and help build support? And I've seen people do this. I saw a facilitated meeting where the change manager started with, this change can happen, why is it going to fail? And then got the group to look about, well, if these are all the reasons for failure, what could we practically put in place to stop these failures? And by the end of the session, had an entire group of people fully supportive because their objections had been answered. They could see that they were going to be managed. It was a wonderful piece of facilitation, but it was a way of doing this. There's a question here that says, if someone is in the trough of the curve for a prolonged period, can they regress through the stages back into anger and blame? Quite simply, yes. In fact, a very common one, if someone is in the self-blame, the bargaining with God, that leads into depression, and that often goes back to the self-blame, it's my fault again. Now, they might strike out in anger occasionally at other people, but normally what happens is that it goes back into the self-blame, which digs the depression any deeper. And it's important that as managers, if we're trying to support our staff, that we're aware of those. So actually, somebody earlier on asked about symptoms. One of the things here is, if you have somebody in your team who is now starting to move away from the rest of the team, who's separating themselves from the rest of the team, what you start to have is a classic example of somebody moving into the self-blame depression and not moving out of it. And if they're disassociating not just from the leader but from the rest of the team, then this is something where not just the leader, the middle manager, but the other team members probably need to be coming to do support. You can see this curve in personal changes and those sorts of things, and I have, in a personal nature, I have a friend who is stuck in that trough at the moment, and what you can do is kind of listen and support. Last couple of things, involving middle managers in developing proposals, make change practical. It comes back to the objections idea. Listen to their critiques, communicate, and the last one here, I think, is an important thing. Translating. The messages of senior management of strategy sometimes aren't the right messages or aren't delivered in the right way to engage effectively with the teams at the front end. What can we provide to middle managers that allow them to translate and communicate that change credibly? So they're not just repeating messages, they're selling proper ideas, they're selling solutions, they're selling what's going on. So what I'm really saying is that our middle managers actually are hugely important in this process. One of the things we talk about in change, and we try to embed change in organizations, is having a network of change agents. The idea of a change agent, the idea of this network, is that people that can facilitate change. They don't necessarily lead it. They often don't have line management authority over the people that may be being changed. but they're there to provide support and guidance, facilitation skills, access to resources, access to knowledge. If we think about this, our middle management should be, oh, I've missed it, that group in the middle. It should be a network in the middle that allows us to grab ideas from the rock, strategy, and mix those together and spread them across the organization. Our middle managers are a network. If we can use that network to spread change, then we can actually do it much more effectively. That we can make sure that everybody's doing this. This means that our middle managers now have essentially a change role as part of their business as usual role. Their job is not just the day-to-day. Their job includes change, and some of their time is therefore allocated. And I think that the question was earlier on is, should line managers be embedded in the change idea? And the answer is yes. If they're our change agents, part of their role is not just to run the day-to-day, it's to think about the future. When I was first being trained as a manager some years ago, one of the concepts that was introduced to me, and I thought was a great idea, was that running the day-to-day, running your team, should not take all of your time. Even as a frontline manager, there must be some time where you're thinking about the future and what's going to be different. Essentially, I was being encouraged to be a change agent. I was encouraged to think about change, and therefore to talk to my colleagues about those sorts of things as well. There's an interesting question that's just come up, if I can move back to. It says, isn't it natural that individual may make a decision to move out of the organization, and therefore change management must plan for this option and determine a response? And that's absolutely right. Part of people's options sometimes is to leave the organization. If they do it whilst they're in depression, then they leave the organization with that sense of failure, that they've done something almost wrong, and therefore when they start another organization, they're still in almost that situation of depression. I personally believe that there should be an acceptance of the change, and that might mean that my decision, my options, my problem solving is to leave the organization, which when I move to the new organization, I have, if you like, the belief it wasn't my fault and I've made a positive choice. I wasn't forced out, essentially. And it's important that I would be supported through that process. So I'm leaving on a positive note, which comes back to the earlier question, rather than a negative note. If we have people leaving when they're in depression, then they go away with a very poor impression of the organization, that they were not well looked after, and they're leaving at their lowest ebb, which does make it much more difficult in newer organizations. Yes, we should plan for this. Yes, we should respond to this. It is sometimes an option that if people don't like the change and they feel it's unworkable for them, that they might decide to leave the organization. But that should be seen as a positive decision, not I've been forced out. And that takes a huge amount of support from people in the change function and your line managers. So it is an important one to kind of pick up as we go through there. I think what I'm doing is making the middle manager's job much, much bigger. So the sorts of things that we need to consider for our middle managers to enable them to be change agents, to enable them to do this, are these sorts of functions, capabilities. Can they disseminate information well? Are they good at presenting? Are they good at sharing ideas? And as part of that, of course, listening. Are our leaders, are our middle managers excellent listeners? Can they understand? Do they double check what they're being told? And in lots of ways, part of the disseminating is therefore the translating of strategy into what this actually means for you. Encouraging, motivating, enabling people to do their work. It's a natural part of the business as usual kind of job, but it is about a key thing. If we're going to do change as well as part of our role, do I have those sorts of skills? The supporting skills. As a brand new manager, I was taught performance counselling. This is not personal counselling, this is performance counselling if people have difficulties. But it allows you to help people solve their own problems. And my solution as a manager was never you should do this. It's, well, what do you think is the right way through this? How do I do this? So if any of you have seen the coaching courses based on the questioning skills, how do you want to solve this? That kind of supporting becomes a hugely important role of the middle manager and change agent. And of course, facilitating. Can I bring a group of people together and run an effective meeting? Can I run a proper workshop? Can I get this group of people who may be strangers to do things together effectively? These sorts of skills are skills for middle managers. These are also the skills for change agents. And therefore, can we use the skills and abilities in our middle managers to change the future? So, if you like, my final thought process was this. Middle managers got where they are because they're good at that job, because they changed themselves. They were motivated to do things, so they got promoted. If we let them stop, then our entire team starts to stagnate. Can we keep that drive, that change, ability, that learning in our middle managers so that they are essentially our change network? We don't need a second arbitrary network of people we have to create. Our middle managers are our network for change. They are the people through which we can change our organization. And it's that kind of thought process that allows an organization to adapt, to grow, whatever its structure. So, really good question, which I was actually going to come to say, how would you recommend working with middle managers who are open to change, always too busy? Or will not commit time discussing suggestions on approving new procedures? One of the interesting things there is why are they too busy? What's going on? As a manager, your job is to manage your team, not to do all of the work. If you're managing the work directly, then you'll run out of time because you're not particularly good at delegating. So if they're always too busy, is it that there's too much work going on, or is it they're taking on too much work? So it's one of the things, the question there is have we created time? As I said, as a new manager, I was encouraged I should have some space in my working week for thinking. Are we allowing managers, are we encouraging middle managers to do this, or are we trying to drive them to the wall so that there is no spare time in their diary? If there's no spare time in their diary, then they have no time for thought process, for learning, for change. So there is a kind of almost organizational thing of how do we treat our people here. If they will not commit time to discussing suggestions to improving new procedures, again, what we have an attitude there is why do they believe that these are not worth listening to? Can we show the value in these? Can we, if you like, teach them? Can they learn that there are some skills, some questions that are worth listening to? There are some cultural elements. There are some personal things about how people believe those sorts of things. There's the kind of thing of, if I make myself indispensable, they can't get rid of me. But if you drive yourself down that route, then sometimes what you find is that your whole thing becomes indispensable because you're a dead end. There's nothing else going on there. So there's no single right way of answering that question, I think, but it is about, it's that kind of learning education thing of why are you always so busy? Are there things you could delegate? Do you have to do these things? And one of the important things here is that learning. Staff learn by being delegated more difficult tasks. If you don't delegate things, your staff will never develop, and therefore you can never leave them behind. You'll always have the same job. Before I joined training, my last comment to my manager was, in 3 months' time, my team will not need me as a leader because they can do all the things that I can do. What do you want to do with me when that point comes? And I was trying to make myself dispensable so my team didn't need me. That meant I could delegate all the work that I had, which meant I could go off and learn something new and do something different. And what they did was they put me into training because they thought that might be a useful place for me. But I guess that was my personal attitude. Do we have those sorts of things coming forward? If I move on, I have another question just here that just says, depression and self-doubt is one response. The adaptive cycle is another way of explaining what's going on. Middle managers can provide a bridge. So other functions are translating between strategy and operations. Absolutely right. I totally agree. Middle managers are the bridge between strategy and function, and it is making sure that translation is done. and there are lots of ways of explaining how we do this. The kublerross curve I showed you is a useful model for personal reactions because it allows us to understand what's going on and what people need. It's not the only one, but it's the ones that are commonly used, which I use as the basis. Any material to support people in setting good change objectives that include some of these change leadership behaviours. I've been using as a reference for both my slides and my talk the Effective Change Manager's Handbook, which is the basis of the course that we're going to talk about a bit later on. I found there's lots of useful things in here. There's far more in the book than in the course than is in the syllabus that I'm talking about. There was an earlier book which was about change management by Cameron and Green, which also has some very useful stuff on there. It doesn't specifically cover change objectives. Change objectives are usually about where we're taking the organisation. One of the things I've seen, and this comes from Managing Successful Programs, it talked about a blueprint for change. If we're doing strategic change, what are all the things that we need to change in the organisation? And it suggested 5 areas that you should consider putting objectives or change areas in. Processes, how do we work? Information, what information do we need? How should it be presented? Organisation, the people, the skills, the numbers, where they're based, the knowledge that they have, the skills they have. And that links into those kind of change leadership behaviours in the future we might want. Tools, what tools and things do we use? What equipment do we have? What facilities do we have? And finally, KPIs. So if I change objectives, if you think P2K, processes, information, tools, organisation, and key performance indicators, if you based your objectives around those 5 areas, some of the organisational ones should pick up leadership behaviours. In the future, we need our leaders to be those sorts of things. So I would suggest things like change management things, but also some of the tools that you might consider in managing successful programs, MSP, those sorts of things, also have some useful change objectives. The course on counselling I mentioned was actually an internal one. So it's please can you confirm the name of the course on counselling you mentioned. This was an internal performance counselling course run by the organisation I happened to work for at the time. And it looked at how do you deal with performance issues in a team environment. And very much it linked into coaching. And there are lots of coaching skills courses. So it looks at rather than giving people solutions, allowing people to explore solutions themselves. There are a number of ones. It's coaching through questioning. I can't remember the specific name of the course, but there are a number of examples. If you look up coaching courses, if you look at counselling courses or performance counselling, you may find things on the internet about those. But so the ones I did were private to the organisation I worked for that developed them, so the title of them would not be relevant at the moment. Question. Also, managers need to see the big picture. Consider Kagan's cognitive levels, middle managers play a key role in viable systems. Absolutely right. And that was the point about middle managers, sharing middle managers the privileged access to the background thinking. If middle managers can understand that thinking and using something like cognitive levels, using something like the big picture, using anything that helps them understand that, middle managers can see why we're doing this. And also they can raise logical objections. Is this a viable system? Would this work? If not, why not? And by encouraging their objections, you often can find them, they will help you find ways to find solutions to those. So it is about sometimes that objection management process. Excuse me. Any suggestions for dealing with people who like or need certainty and security? They choose jobs which they thought would give them that, and now you're upending their world. This is actually a natural part of change. One of the suggestions I would have here is consider small, well-defined changes with some space to allow them to integrate that change into their world. There's a model that I've dealt with, the head of learning I worked with at the water company I worked, a gentleman called Sudhanshu Palsuli, development model that talked about how people react to change. And what we have is people who struggle with change, which is kind of what you're talking about. They like that security. What we need to ensure is they understand the need for change. We need to essentially do it in smaller bite-sized pieces so we don't threaten their world completely. And we need to give them time to embed those changes before we do something else. So what we have there essentially would be a strategy of slow and steady rather than quick and fast. And if we can get their mind to do this, then it makes it much easier. But that would be my suggestion to the strategy process. With other teams, quick and fast is much better because they can get it down, they can move on quickly. But it will vary group to group. Next question. Good point, entrenchment management. Absolutely. Keeping things embedded. If you've got people in their place and there's a value in being there, they will stay there, they will help you work. Question. How would a frontline employee manage an ineffective middle manager? Managing upwards is always an interesting and difficult thing. Important one there would be it's sometimes what do you expect of me? It's almost like a bargaining solution. If I give you an example, as a project manager, sometimes I've worked for a project sponsor who hasn't understood the role of a project sponsor and doesn't know how to do it effectively. And so often what I need to do is agree a working relationship between the pair of us. And so I've said as a project manager to my sponsor, I'm your project manager, what do you expect from me? And they give me a long list of things they want me to do. I can then say, right, okay, I can do all these things, but if you want me to do X, I need something from you. You want to do Y, and what I can start to do then is it was almost I can do this, but, and if as a frontline manager, you can have that conversation with, what is it you want me to do? I can do this, but what you're almost doing is pushing your middle manager to be more effective by coming to agreement of how you work together. It does take some practice. It does take some confidence to do so. But that is perhaps a way. It's a strategy. There are presently others. I shall have to move on. I suspect we're running out of time for these. Question. How can you manage expectations where deadlines are set for change which do not align with the management of the change curve? In most cases, everything is expected tomorrow at every level and from every level of management. Absolutely. They want everything, and it's going to be perfect, and they want it yesterday sometimes. One of the things there is realistic expectations. It comes back to clear objectives. What is actually possible? So one of the things we've got to consider here is, as a middle manager, what's happening to your people? Where are they? You have to deliver change in an organization, and there's a technical process for delivering change and systems and those sorts of things. But aligned to that is people moving through the change curve. And if you have people who move through the change curve slowly, then you have to start the people change long before you start the technical change. It is understanding those two things to try and align them. They don't work at the same rate. But understanding the culture and your people gives you a much better chance to start and do those sorts of things. Change doesn't happen tomorrow. There's always a technical process to go through. And for example, if you have to change culture, how people behave and believe, when we're talking about a 5-year to 10-year process, so the expectation of I want it tomorrow is unrealistic, and sometimes we just have to say that's not possible. Again, that's confidence from the people delivering the change. So change better come from middle managers. I think so. Change better to come from middle managers or from front line. I think the answer is change can come from anywhere. But what we need is we need our middle managers to be encouraging and supporting change rather than just being there to run the business as usual. Part of their role should be a change agent. Part of their role should be to encourage change from both being fed down and being fed up. So it's the kind of listening, translating stuff. But we need that middle layer, rather than being the corporate concrete, to being the enabling part of the organization, to be the network that spreads change across the organization. If you look at Morgan's metaphor organisms, then that's kind of how the organism works, is that information is spread effectively and shared effectively across the organization. The middle management team become that great network for doing so. Next question. Some line managers take the advantage of their frontline staff's hard works and efforts initiatives, getting the recognition for themselves. I believe ethics and integrity is one of the core for changes too. I haven't mentioned those. I would absolutely agree. Whenever something happens successfully, the manager will always get the recognition it's their team that's improved things. But it's important, ethically and for integrity reasons, to share that with your staff. And staff recognise that in managers, and therefore you start to know what's going on. I would put ethics and integrity as being an actual part of being a manager, whether you're doing change or being anything else. Without those, it is difficult. I did see a manager who had a poster on the wall that said, "Sincerity is the key, fake that, you've got it made." I'm hoping they never believed it. Certainly I never believed it as a manager. And if you have a manager that is behaving like that, and it's kind of the ineffective one that the earlier question was about, and then you do always have a choice about that as employees, I suspect. And that is one of those sorts of things that will annoy individuals, which is often why individuals make choices about where they work and who they work for, given those sorts of choices. So ethics and integrity, fundamental to management, leadership, not just change, but it's in there as well. If I move on. Middle management task is not operational task, but as translated mentoring. Absolutely. It's what I'm trying to say is that it's not just translating mentoring the business as usual, it's also translating mentoring change within those sorts of things. So it's to focus on keeping both halves of the business going, the business as usual element and the change element, so that we don't have a successful business now, we have a successful business in the future. If I can move on. Do you think middle management diversity and proposal can help changes take place? If we have, I think what helps changes take place is effective change management and effective delivery of projects. And I think middle management have a part to play in supporting those. In terms of diversity, I think organisations need diversity in all things, in who they have, what sex they are, gender, all those sorts of things, but particularly in how they think, because different thought processes, different problem-solving processes give you different solutions, give you different ways of working, which is the best way forward. So that's kind of, yeah, I think we need diversity in organisation. It helps the organisation. It will help change as well, because we have better ways of solving things. We don't have a single way forward, I think is the right answer. How do we manage forced changes? Middle management is not happy with these, but these are important for the organisation. This is actually always difficult. If we have an imposed change, now these are often structural because of maybe legislation or those sorts of things. It can be forced because people see we need to use other different things. The translation process there for the middle managers is, how do I explain these in terms of why we have to do this? Remember, the middle managers are having to comply with this as well. So while they need to understand what's happening, the bigger picture, and I think in those situations, it's the honesty, it's the integrity that says, well, actually, I'm not particularly keen on it, but this is why it's got to be done, and this is why I understand about it, and this is why it has to be done, and why we are going to do it. So the two things are, one is honesty, how do you feel about it? And two is commitment, but we're going to have to do it as well. But it's allowing people sometimes to see that privileged information of why is this change actually necessary, why is it being forced. The next comment is, I believe transparency is key, particularly from senior management, especially when change impacts on senior management. Most times this does not happen. Is the reason for this particularly from senior management perspective? And I think, yes, I think what you're just saying there, transparency, is coming out of what we're just saying about the integrity, about the ethics. If there is not transparency, this is when we start to get greater degrees of anger in staff and in middle managers, because is there something being hidden from us? Why are we not being party to this privileged information about the change? And because of that, you get more questions and you do get more resistance. Now, is there a reason for this from senior management? The simple answer is, I don't know. It would depend on the circumstances in that particular organisation. Personally, I can't see a reason for it unless there is some particular advantage the senior management getting which they don't wish to share. In which case, one of the things you have to question is, what is the reason for this change really? Is it just to improve my position and does nothing to the organisation? If staff can see that it benefits the organisation long term, then they can see it benefits them because that's about jobs, that's about opportunity, that's about consistency of employment and those sorts of things. If that's not the reason for doing the change, it's just to line their pockets, then you might question their ethics and their reasons for doing it. So transparency is key, and if we don't have it, it is going to cause problems, I think, is the answer. So if I move on. So the lazy 8 so it says kublerross is good, but you'll find the lazy 8 adaptive cycle very useful. As you show, when you reach the hysterical depression stage, you can reorganize and do adaptions. That is a model that I'm not aware of. I will just make a note on that. So lazy 8 adaptive, and I'll look it up, and thank you very much for your comment. Change, learning, it's always worth having these new ones, so thank you for your input, and I shall take it away and have a look at it. Thank you. Dealing with people who really dig in their heels about changing their behaviours, passive aggressive, etc. One of the things here, and if you look at change adaptation, it talks about innovators and early adapters. The last group are often called the laggards, the people who dig in their heels about changing their behaviours. The point I made earlier on is, why? Is it just that they don't like change and they refuse to change because it's just something they don't do, or is it they have some valid objections to the change about what's going on? And therefore, as the leadership team, do we understand those? What it does is, if they're just against the change and they're negative, just for being negative reasons, it's how can I isolate them so that they don't damage the rest of the change? Because if they have no support, then either they have to change themselves or they will try and remove themselves from that situation. They will make a positive choice. If they have some valid objections, then you need to answer those valid objections by understanding why they're really digging their heels in. So it is that kind of support, questioning, listening stuff that would help that one. But that is a natural part of change. There are people who are automatically for the change, and there are people who resist it, the laggards. You need to understand why, and then you can start to answer those sorts of questions. And again, there are lots of other techniques, probably not the right thing to go into do. Do you agree middle managers require careful management by senior managers, as they like to be the people who have transferable skills, who often move for career progression? Mass movement by middle managers can have a serious impact on frontline staff who may not have the skills to move employment, and will view this very negatively. Absolutely. Your middle managers have a huge amount of knowledge and skill, and because they're often not actually doing the day-to-day, they're about managing, they're leading, they're supporting, they're facilitating, those skills are hugely transferable. And if they all leave, you have lost as an organisation all that knowledge and that skill. And if we don't have the next generation of managers coming forward, then we have a serious black hole in the middle of our organisation. So, are we looking after them? So if we looked at the kublerross curve earlier on, are senior managers providing the same level of support to our middle managers? Are you as middle managers feeling that you're being looked after so that you can make positive choices about staying with the organisation for development opportunity purposes? If as a group you decide to leave, that actually has hugely negative consequences both for the organisation and for your staff, who suddenly now have no leaders to deal with because it's all gone. So yes, I think there's a simple answer to that one. And if I move on, how would you work in a change situation with middle management like a layer of clay? They've seen the organisation but won't be doing anything about it. Who should be addressed with this question in the company? This comes back to the early comment about, if like, why? Yeah, you said things and they kind of get stuck in there and it doesn't really move. They are the corporate concrete, they are the absorbent layer. One of the things is to consider is why. Is it time? And if it's time, is there something they should delegate to free up some time? What are they doing that means they don't have time for change? Or why are they resisting the change? Is it because they just don't like change, laggards? Or is it because they have some fundamental objections which you might need to address and mitigate? So it is, again, like the previous question, let's ask some questions why. Let's understand why they're being like clay, and then we might need to do something about it. Now, it might all be that they need some kind of experience. They've never worked in that kind of environment before. They don't understand the new culture. Can we do something to support those? If I give you a quick example, working for Ward's government here in the UK, what we had was that I joined the organisation after it had been privatised, but it kind of carried on. And one of the things that they needed in the organisation was an understanding of that as a commercial organisation, how do commercial organisations work? And a good chunk of the organisation had never worked in a commercial environment. So as a training session, we took great groups of people out and ran a business game where essentially they were running their own little business in competition with other people doing the same sort of thing. So they could see the need for a customer service and investment and for making profit, so that you actually had those sorts of things. Now, that business game cost a huge amount, and it was very expensive to run, and delivered no long-term benefit in what people actually did in their day-to-day work. What it did give was an understanding of the circumstances, the context of the organisation, and how different it was to being a public utility. And so it was more about enabling people to see, if you like, over the fence into a different world and understand what that world was. And I hope, I like to think, that that actually was one of those small things and allowing people to understand how it works. Another question. We do coaching as part of our PMI course. Excellent. Coaching, fundamental part of change, and as part of your, if you're doing the PMP or any other PMI course, it will be a very useful skill to have in all the things you're going to do. It will link into facilitation and other things as well. Next comment, I would add organisational cognitive capacity and levels, as in Keegan's levels. If the manager operating at a high level than where the upper manager organisations at, they can be out or step. Absolutely. This then comes down to individuals and how do they work together. And if you have kind of on juxtaposition of skills at a different layer, then you do have those kind of conflicts going on. So it is about, as an organisation, are we encouraging development of all our staff, not just of certain people? So it might pick those sorts of things up. And again, I'm going to make a note of Keegan's levels and have a look at those. Also, comment, middle managers are senior managers of the future. Absolutely. If we don't retain them, we don't have the senior managers. So if we can encourage them, they will be our senior managers as we go forward. It also means in lots of ways that we can promote internally rather than have to buy in a very expensive person from outside. So that actually might give some benefits to the organisation. Okay, come to the point here where we're going to answer any other questions offline, but thank you very much for your time and questions. If I can pass you on to my colleague William, who's actually going to deal with some offers.
Hello. First of all, Andy, thank you very much for that. I'll just give a brief introduction. My name is William Jenkins. I am a business development manager here at ILX. Just wanted to go over some opportunities and the commercials of taking the International Change Management course accredited by the APMG. So as you can see on your screen, we have the Foundation e-learning, where a 12-month license would cost you 675 Australian dollars or 730 New Zealand dollars. That is for the Foundation e-learning. If for any of you that are interested in classroom courses, either Foundation or practitioner, please contact us and we'll be happy to help. I would also like to add that if we've got anyone still online that is not based in Australia or New Zealand and is interested in pricing, then please come back to us and we'll be happy to help. And then, Andy, if you could just turn me over to the next page, that'd be very helpful. We also, as you can see, have an offer available until May the 4th. This pricing is based in Australian dollars, where you can have 3-month access to the Foundation e-learning change management course for 189 Australian dollars. As I say, if you're interested in any deals, then please contact the Australian or New Zealand offices on the numbers below. If for any As I say, for any people that are interested outside of those areas in pricing, you can contact myself directly, and my email address is william.jenkins, which is JENKINS @ilxgroup.com, and I'll be happy to help. Thank you very much. Andy, I'll pass back over to you.
Okay. Thank you very much, everybody, for your attention. Thank you for listening. I hope you found this useful, enjoyable. The slides and the comments will be copied, as will be recorded, and sent out to you shortly. Thank you very much indeed.